I welcome everyone on behalf of the Network of Quality Teaching and Learning. My name is Azra Naseem. Welcome to the EdTech Lounge. If you have been to this EdTech Lounge before, then you know the format, but those who are joining us for the first time, EdTech Lounge at Al Khan University is a virtual space for faculty members to share experiences of teaching and learning with technology. The format of EdTech Lounge is very simple. The presenter will speak for about 15 minutes where they will share experiences and they will offer some suggestions for to online learning. After the talk, we will allocate about 15 to 20 minutes for question and answers. Today's faculty member is Dr. Sadaf Khan, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sadaf Khan. Dr. Sadaf Khan is a colon and rectal surgeon by training and has a keen interest in medical education for all levels of trainees. As Associate Dean, Undergraduate Medical Education Program at Al Khan University Medical College, Dr. Khan is currently overseeing the development and implementation of online curricula for the medical college. So welcome, Dr. Sadaf, and over to you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the privilege of being able to speak to you today and share some of our experiences in the undergraduate medical program. All right, so we're going to talk about the online examination, options, challenges, and pitfalls. So the first thing is whenever you're looking at an online test or assessment, the question is what are the guiding principles? And in my mind, so I want to make this disclaimer that whatever I say today is based on the situation that we found ourselves in. And although it is grounded in other people's experience and literature, but this situation was extremely unusual because what it required was an emergency switching over to a different method of assessment or different mode of delivery of assessment without all the due diligence that goes with it. So the guiding principles that I feel are important is what are the conditions that must be met for the implementation of online assessments. And as far as I'm concerned, the ideal online assessment needs three basic conditions to be met. The first thing is validity, that whatever method of assessment should be measuring, should be at par with the objectives of what you want to measure. And that goes for every kind of assessment. So an MCQ is a terrible way to assess communication skills or a clinical examination skill. So the same is valid for when we come to online assessment. Then the ability to implement, in every situation, in every geographic context, in every socioeconomic context, there are certain restrictions and certain challenges that one faces when implementing online assessment. And although around the world there are multiple tools, multiple platforms available that have been used very successfully for online testing, they may not be available to us or may not be available emergently. We may not have the technical ability to implement those things. So whatever plan you choose, you should be able to ultimately implement it. And the last and perhaps the most important is that for every teacher, the biggest stressor is how do you guarantee as much as possible the integrity of the examination? How do you make sure as much as possible that the person, that the student who is attempting the examination is the right person, that somebody else isn't answering for them, that there's no, sort of cheating going on or plagiarism going on. So once you have these three things, you get the somewhat ideal online assessment. So I'm going to talk about our medical college experience to start with, and then And just before this talk, I changed the sequence of slides. I was going to talk about the process first and then the experience later, but decided to change it. So we'll talk about the experience first. So what happened was that when we went online, when this whole shutdown happened, we were doing teaching online. And along the way, we determined that, look, we haven't done pure online teaching before. For the medical curriculum, we hadn't even been doing blended learning for the majority of the classes that we were teaching online, which is the preclinical years, that is the first and second year of the MBBS program. So once we implemented the teaching, we realized that we needed to assess what we were teaching and what the students were learning. And so we implemented a whole series of formative assessments where they would have MCQs, short answer questions, things like that, built into the module. Now, as it became clear that the lockdown would move forward, meaning that students would not be able to come back to campus, we decided that in order to keep the students on track as far as their curriculum is concerned, we are going to add the summative assessments into the online experience. And after much deliberation, we decided that we would use our VLE Moodle platform, which was already widely available, and because we had been teaching through it, that both the students and faculty were familiar with that platform. So we are using VLE, and for proctoring, we are using Zoom. And I'll go through all these details and how we came to that conclusion along the way. When we are administering the test, we maximize randomization, and that is actually a feature that is present in Moodle itself. It mixes up the questions, it mixes up the sequence of options so that it becomes very difficult for overt cheating. We put one item per page. We use the chat feature, and these things I'll talk about as we move along so that I can explain why we do these things. If you look at how the exam goes, this is what it looks like, where you have a proctor sitting on campus looking at a Zoom room that has about 9 students each. We can look at each of the students, their face, their hands, and their screens. This is being recorded constantly. Just a closer look of what we are able to see. Debriefing meetings afterwards, and of course pre-exam meetings as well. And that is sort of the sum of the exam. And we'll talk about more. I rushed through it because I wanted to tell you what the planning consists of. So when you are planning, the first thing you obviously have to do is decide what you are assessing. We looked at the curriculum that we had delivered. There were things in there that could not be addressed because they needed hands-on or face-to-face interactions. Those were parked to the side, and only objectives that we taught, we assessed. Identify the appropriate testing modality, and that goes without saying. That goes for every assessment that we design. So because this was just testing cognitive ability, we went with the MCQs, short answer questions, EMQs, things like that. The next thing is that you have to turn around and take stock of what your technologic capability is. So as I mentioned before, we had Moodle, so we decided to stick with Moodle. During our first iteration, we decided that we would use Microsoft Teams to do the proctoring. And we had the same mechanism as we now have with Zoom, where we have 9 people in a room. And that we were very happy about that because, we had those licenses, we were using Microsoft Teams as an institution. There wasn't any extra purchasing or licensing, anything involved. But what happened with that was, what we found was that when we saw the recordings afterwards of the entire interaction, at any given point, there were only 4 students visible on a screen. And that is somewhat random because when students move or there's a sound, then it flips over so that the person who moved or where the sound originated, that person comes on the screen. And so it was not a really good way for us to monitor after the event. And that becomes very important because what we found after our first pilot, in which we used Microsoft Teams, when we went back to look at the recordings, there were irregularities that we could pick up that occurred during the course of the examination. Now, before I say anything, this was entirely a pilot. It had no impact on the students' progression or anything like that. But we asked them to sort of almost like pretend that this was a real exam. And the silver lining of this was, of them not pretending completely, was that at some point in time, kids sort of picked up and looked at their phone, or they started browsing another window, whether it was related to the test or not. But those things, sometimes when they happened really quickly, couldn't be picked up in real time, and were picked up when we looked at the recordings. So what that told us was that Microsoft Teams was not a good method for us to monitor the exam. So in subsequent attempts, we used Zoom, and for the second pilot, we used Zoom and Panopto together, where we recorded the entire proceedings. And by the third pilot, we realized that Zoom did pretty well, and we could just drop Panopto from the monitoring. So finally, Zoom, Moodle for administration of the exam, and Zoom for the proctoring of the exam. The next thing in terms of the testing modality or the testing platform, as I said, we use Moodle. And a couple of things that we learned along the way is that it's very important that you have one item per page when the students are going through the exam. Because when we ran our first pilot, what happened was that there were a couple of questions that they could go scroll through on the same screen. But if at any point in time they lost connectivity, they didn't know till 5-10 minutes had passed, and then that leads to a whole panic both on our end and the student's end. But if you have one question at a time, every time they move to the next page, they are made aware of whether they are still connected or not. So you don't lose any answers, you don't lose time, and it's a much safer way to do it. As far as augmenting technological capabilities, wherever you are based, there you will have different options. The ideal thing that people opt for is having a lockdown browser. And for our first pilot, we did try and use a lockdown browser, commercially available. It's called Respondus. And they were having a free trial, and we downloaded it, we put it into our system, we tested it on campus, and it worked very, very well. However, man proposes, God disposes. When we implemented it for that first pilot, it was a disaster. 80% of the students could not, once they clicked and launched the browser, they could not access the test. And what we realized was that Respondus was very heavily dependent on internet capability, bandwidth, the G status, and that was that exam just could not be run because 80% of the tests it blocked out. So the capability, beware of investing monetarily into things without testing them in your particular context, because Respondus is used very frequently, or browsers such as that are used on a regular basis by our Western counterparts. Human resource, just because the exam is online does not in any way mean that you need less in terms of human resource. In fact, I think you need more because if you're proctoring an exam here, at most in one lecture theater, you need 2 or 3 proctors, but here we needed a minimum of 9 to 10 proctors, well-trained, totally attentive for the entire duration of the exam. And these are people who have to be tech savvy, who should be able to navigate through these different screens, should be able to communicate through these different platforms. There has to be enough qualified technical support. Whenever we ran these exams, we had at least 5 or 6 people who, at least 3 people who were from IT and the other people who were sort of technically adept to troubleshoot with all these machines and all these systems. And then also part of the planning, you should revisit what the weightage of that assessment is when you look in the context of the student's total performance. For example, you may have a certain test that may contribute, say, 10% to the final annual score. And it would be worthwhile that if you have assessments that have very high weightage, in this situation, you may want to reduce the weightage of those assessments, because this is new for you and it is very new for the students as well. And also you have to keep in mind that different students have different internet capabilities, and you don't want to disadvantage any student too much. We are still considering, we're still in the process of discussing whether we would have a pass-fail option for these tests, or for these courses in general. I don't know whether we have a clear university directive yet. I think at this point in time, programs are looking at it individually. But other universities around the world are offering their students the option to take a pass-fail option for a certain course. And each program will have to look and see what the implication is of taking the pass-fail option on finally progression through the program, on things such as whether students get honors or scholarships, or whether they fail a year or part of the program because of taking the pass-fail option. So I think each program will have to look at it independently. So that sums up sort of what goes on the planning end. Now, when you look at the process is very important. The first thing that happens is once you decide what platform you're going to use, what you're going to use for proctoring, how many people you're going to use, and what the implications of this exam will be, the next step is comprehensive training of all people involved and conducting multiple pilots. So we conducted 3 pilots before we finally said, okay, this is going to work now. And each pilot was countless man hours of work. The training is very important, not only for people who are going to administer the exam, but also for the students. And I'll give you an example. So when we log on to, when the student logs on to their Zoom classroom, each student goes through a proximity check where they walk the proctor with their device. And just to clarify, each student has 2 devices. One device is the laptop or desktop on which they will log on to the Moodle and take the test. And the second device is the proctoring device. So it can be a phone, a smartphone, or it can be an iPad, like a tablet, that is placed sort of right behind them. And that is actually looking at the student, their screen, and their hands. So when the student logs on to the Zoom room, they take the camera and they walk around the room, they look under the desk, under the bed, behind them, look at their hands, make sure that there are no books around, things like that. So when we started doing it the first time at the first pilot, it took almost 45 minutes to get 9 students to go through the proximity check and to get their camera positioned in the appropriate place. However, by the time we came to the examination, which was basically their 4th experience, it took all of 15 minutes to get all 9 students together. And they did it so much more confidently without the anxiety that they were having in the first one. And that works all around for everyone. So it's very important to have comprehensive training and the pilots, and those 2 things sort of go hand in hand. The next thing that I think is very important, and I touched on it as a requirement for these assessments, is the issue of integrity. So the students have to understand very clearly what the implications of dishonest practice are. And we have to be very clear about what constitutes dishonest practice here. As teachers, we intuitively sort of know what is dishonest, but for students who have been used to just working in the classroom, where what is dishonest is sharing answers with someone or having something down, writing something down on a piece of paper, may not be of a huge concern when they're doing it online. When they're doing it online, it is having another tab open or having another device open or having somebody in the room telling you what you're doing or being connected on a WhatsApp group to somebody else. And because this whole situation is sort of unreal for students as well, I think it behooves us to spell out very clearly that, look, I know we know it is a hard situation, but the rules of integrity still hold. And that the implications will be the same as if you were in a classroom taking a test and you were caught doing something dishonest. So I think that is very important, should be upfront. The way we dealt with it is that before they launched the Moodle page, there was a little statement that said that I understand the rules as defined by, there was our little thing by the Office of UG&E, and that I understand that if I sort of break any of these rules, there are the consequences according to the student code of conduct. And then they hit I agree, and then the test launches. So that's very important. And then again, I said, whereas not everybody agrees on the visual monitoring, if you were doing something like Respondus, you wouldn't do visual monitoring, but we strongly suggest that visual monitoring be used during the examination. And the last and perhaps the most important thing is that, again, this is a very new situation for everyone. There has to be very open and active communication between all stakeholders, starting well before the examination, during the examination, and after the examination. So before the examination, we had we had WhatsApp groups for all the students, we had groups for all the proctors, the faculty, the administrative staff, the IT support, we made sure to create an environment where everybody was able to say very clearly if there was an issue that they think needed to be taken care of. Because the last thing, it's new for everyone, the last thing is where we want to say, look, this is one person's idea of how it wants to be done, how it has to be done, and do it that way. This requires input from everybody as you experience your problems in your particular context. The other thing is that students need to be aware that this isn't anybody, this whole thing is not to make it hard for them. This entire thing has to be designed to be easy for them, to allow them to progress in a stress-free, anxiety-free manner. There is always the anxiety of having a summative assessment, but we can't let the mode of the assessment add to that anxiety. During the examination, in the first pilots, we found that students were very stressed out when they lost contact, or what would happen is that the camera was not set in the right place and all of a sudden the proctor couldn't see the student. So everybody's anxious now. They're trying to call the student, but because we had them silence their phones, they couldn't hear, or when the student tried to move to the next question, they realized they were logged off and they couldn't get back on. They're stressed out, running around now. So the way we got around a lot of these issues was that in Moodle, there is a feature in which you can chat with the individual student. And we use that very freely now, and the student can chat as well. Because before, what we would do is that we were talking to them over Zoom, but what that does is it disturbs everybody else. Keeping the microphones on was something that we used to necessitate when we first started, but we realized that that creates so much background noise that it makes it impossible for the students to think. So now we don't have the mics on. We use the chat box very frequently as needed. We have robust WhatsApp groups between all the IT support and the tech support. So the moment one proctor sends off a flag that I need help with, this room, you have 2 people who respond to that immediately. And then afterwards, very important to debrief so that you get a good idea of all the issues that came up and adjust them in real time. I think one of the most important things for the school process is that wherever you are, you have to be very, very proactive, reactive. You have to be very flexible and constantly morphing so that you get the best possible test for you. So I'm going to stop talking. Thank you very much.